Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was getting up to ask a question, but I'll give a speech. I rise to speak on Motion 177, which instructs the Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities to study issues faced by flight training schools in Canada. And as the chair of the All-Party Aviation Caucus and a pilot myself, I'm quite familiar with the industry and the flight training process and the lack of pilots. I hate to date myself, Mr. Speaker, but back in 1968, when I went to apply and start my pilot training, it wasn't very expensive. It was about $500 to get a private pilot's license. And then later on in life, in the late 70s, I went on to get a commercial pilot's license, and gave me a chance to expand my experiences and do different things. M177 calls for the committee to study the challenges faced by flight schools in providing trained pilots and determining their infrastructure, is it adequate in our flight schools. However, I am concerned with this because even if you have state-of-the-art infrastructure, you can't use it if there's no one to train, and that's where my concern comes in. I think the study would have a much larger impact if it were amended to focus on pilot shortages and the factors that deter students from enrolling in the first place. If you remember back in the 1950s and 60s, it's often been referred as the golden age of air travel. Pilots and flight attendants were seen as an elite class, and recruitment was high. Flash forward the last 10 or 15 years, and all those recruits have retired. At the same time, the ability to become a pilot has become increasingly more expensive and difficult. Remember, Mr. Speaker, I said $500 back in the day when I started to fly. Today, an average private pilot's license in Canada will cost you upwards of $14,000. As safety standards have increased, which is by no means a bad thing, there's been more requirements placed on young pilots learning to fly. And when I learned to fly, you can get a pilot's license in 35 to 40 hours. Today in Canada, the average is 60 hours. They have to train more hours, and they have to maintain a certain number of flight hours each year to maintain that license. All this extra time means extra money they have to spend for certification. For your commercial license, a minimum of 200 hours of flight training must be obtained. And Mr. Speaker, I just mentioned that a private pilot's license costs about $14,000. That if you're really good and you're fast and you do everything currently, to get a commercial pilot's license, a basic commercial pilot's license, about $18,500 will get you there over and above your private license. And this is for such things as 5 hours for night, 2 of which must be cross-country. You also need to accumulate 5 hours more cross-country time than your private, and at least 20 hours of instrument time. You require 30 hours of solo after obtaining your private pilot's license. Furthermore, 100 hours of pilot and command before you can go on to your commercial pilot's license. By the end of all of this, with your cost of living and everything else going in there, you'll have spent $50,000 or more to get a commercial pilot's license alone. The Canadian aviation regulations tell us that in addition to having a valid license or permit and a valid medical certificate, there are some things that pilots need to do every 5 years. And this scares a lot of people. Every 2 years and every 6 months if they want to maintain their license. Every 5 years, a pilot must fly as a pilot in command or a co-pilot at least once. Every 2 years, pilots must complete recurrency training. Every 6 months, pilots who wish to carry on one or more flights with passengers must take 5 recent takeoffs and landings. Plus, there are the medicals, and as you get older, age 40, you have to have medicals every 6 months. I don't think the problem is so much the quality of the flight schools in Canada, but the inability to attract recruits due to the cost and time required. Even the Canadian Air Force has experienced a shortage. The shortfall in pilots and mechanics was referenced in an internal report recently published by the Department of National Defense. The Air Force is authorized to have 1,580 pilots, but it is short by around 17%, or 275 pilots. In the civilian world, Boeing has projected that the worldwide aviation will need 790,000 new pilots by 2037 to meet the growing demand, with 96,000 pilots needed to support the business aviation sector. At the Farnborough Air School in the United Kingdom, Airbus recently estimated a demand of 450,000 pilots needed by 2035. Even with Airbus, more conservative numbers, the gap between demand and supply is very vast. That is why I believe this motion is very important. We need to study the availability of pilots, and including how we can increase recruitment levels. There are a lot of ways this can be done, Mr. Speaker. For example, the government can create incentives for experienced pilots to stay in the industry or set up financial assistance to flight schools. And I'd like to refer back to the 60s when I went for my private pilot's license. It was $500, Mr. Speaker. And if I continued on to my commercial, I got a fifth of that back, a whole $100 back if I continued on to my commercial. And then when I got my commercial back, I believe it was 1/3 of that back, and I could deduct all my taxes, income tax and everything. These are just some examples that we need to study more in depth. An increase in pilots could also help in consumer choices down the road. When I flew to Ottawa for my riding yesterday, I only had 2 options for different airlines. It's hard to expect an industry to be diversified and complete when they don't have enough talent to draw on. I've read in many cases in the news where flights have been canceled because the crews need to rest and there isn't another crew to replace them. From a pilot and a safety standpoint, I completely understand the need for rest. But as a consumer, this can be incredibly frustrating. If we had more pilots, perhaps a lot of these cancellations could be avoided because there would be someone to replace those that need rest. Increasing and retaining pilots could help increase airline choices for Canadians and benefit the consumer experience when flying. And we don't only need pilots for these large airline companies. There are a lot of other industries in Canada that rely on pilots. They courier our mail. They help control our forest fires. They help rescue stranded hikers. They monitor our forests and pipelines. They belong to CASERA, Canadian Air Search and Rescue. In my own riding, oil companies have pilots who fly over pipeline routes and make sure there aren't any leaks or other issues. We also have pilots who fly over the forest in Jasper National Park to document the spread of forest pests like the mountain pine beetle. Pilots are needed in many industries across this country. We need to explore ways to increase the number of recruits to flight schools. As a pilot and a member of the All-Party Aviation Caucus, I want to see this study go to committee. I hope the sponsor will consider our amendments to ensure this study has the most impact possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well said.